The morning mist still clung to the cobbled streets of Weatherfield, but within the usually bustling undertaker's parlor of George Shuttleworth, a different kind of chill had settled. George, a man accustomed to the solemnities of life and death, found himself grappling with a disquieting conversation he'd had with Todd Grimshaw. Todd, vibrant and seemingly in the prime of his life, had spoken of his own funeral, not with morbid fascination, but with a strange, almost detached practicality. Day in, day out, we stare death in the face, Todd had mused, his eyes distant, but it's dawned on me I haven't even planned my own funeral yet. George, ever the pragmatic friend, had tried to brush it off, suggesting Todd had plenty of time. But Todd's words, the Grim Reaper could be lurking around the corner now, just sizing me up, pointing at me with his bony finger, had echoed in George's mind long after their exchange. There was an unsettling finality in Todd's tone, a hint of something unsaid, something deeply troubling. Later, George found himself confiding in Eileen. "There's something I don't know," he confessed, the worry etched on his face. Eileen, with her maternal instincts sharpened by years of looking out for Todd, immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. "If it's something serious, you need to know about it. George, his mother is not here. You're the nearest thing he's got to a parent." The words spurred George into action, albeit with a heavy conscience about invading Todd's privacy. A quick, surreptitious check of Todd's emails, prompted by Eileen's insistence, revealed a bombshell: Weatherfield Hospital confirming an appointment for today. "But he's there now getting results for tests." A cold dread washed over George. This wasn't a whimsical musing, this was real. Todd was facing something serious, and he was doing it alone. Meanwhile, a world away from George's mounting panic, Todd was attempting to navigate a tense business meeting with Gary Windass and a potential new client, Pete, a formidable figure from Manchester's building industry. The air was thick with ambition and the promise of lucrative contracts, but Todd's mind was elsewhere. He tried to focus, to engage, but the weight of his secret, the impending results, pressed down on him. "You okay?" Gary had asked, sensing Todd's distraction. "Yeah, fine," Todd had replied, a lie that felt increasingly fragile. The conversation veered, as it often did, to the complexities of relationships. George, ever the matchmaker and confidant, had pressed Todd about Christina, hinting at Todd's supposed attraction to domineering women. Todd, bristling at the suggestion, defended Christina, describing her brash exterior as merely a shield for a heart of pure gold. But even as he spoke, his thoughts were fractured, his facade cracking under the strain. The hospital corridors, usually a blur of controlled chaos, seemed to amplify Todd's isolation. He sat, waiting, the sterile smell of disinfectant a sharp contrast to the vibrant life he was trying to cling to. The doctor's words, when they finally came, were a blur of medical terminology and grave pronouncements. "Blood in my poo," Todd later confided to George. "I'm knackered all the time and got really shaky yesterday." He spoke of low blood sugars, dismissing it with a grim attempt at humor about emergency donuts, but the underlying fear was palpable. Just as Todd was trying to process the news, his phone rang. "Billy." The call was garbled, the reception bad, but the sheer desperation in Billy's voice was clear. What have they said?" "Hello?" Todd, unable to hear, was cut off. The phone slipped from his hand, the world around him tilting. He needed to be alone, to process this new, terrifying reality. Unbeknownst to Todd, George, driven by a fatherly concern, had followed him to the hospital. Hiding behind a pillar, watching Todd emerge, pale and shaken, George's heart ached. He longed to offer comfort, but something held him back, a respect for Todd's privacy, and perhaps, a fear of what he might hear. Later, in the solace of Billy's flat, a fragile sense of relief mingled with the lingering anxiety. "It was good news," Todd exclaimed, a forced joviality in his voice, as he celebrated dodging the coffin with Billy and George. He seemed determined to push away the darkness, to embrace life with a newfound urgency. But the joy felt hollow, a temporary reprieve from a battle he knew was far from over. Yet, even in his celebration, Todd couldn't escape the ghosts of the past. Billy, reflecting on the grief of losing Paul, spoke of the enduring pain, the loneliness. "The bond that Paul and I shared, the depth of our love, I don't think I'm ever going to find anything like that ever again. I'm so lonely without him." Todd listened, a profound understanding in his eyes. He knew, intimately, the fear of losing what you hold dear, the terror of facing the unknown alone. The evening descended into a drunken stupor for Todd, a desperate attempt to drown out the fear and uncertainty. He clung to Billy, confessing his inability to cope when he was like this, wanting only to stay with his friend. Billy, ever the steadfast companion, assured him of his unwavering support. The next day, the facade began to crumble further. A disoriented Todd, still reeling from the previous night, found himself in George's flat, his erratic behavior a clear sign that something was deeply amiss. George, ever the patient one, tried to navigate Todd's drunken ramblings, his heart heavy with concern. As Todd eventually passed out, George and Eileen were left to ponder the true nature of his good news. Was it a complete reprieve, or a temporary one? The fear that Todd was still hiding something, still carrying a heavy burden, gnawed at them. The truth, they knew, was far more complex than Todd was letting on, and the path ahead for him, and for those who loved him, was fraught with uncertainty and heartache. The quiet determination to unravel Todd's secret had now become a burning necessity, for the sake of his life, and their own peace of mind. The hushed stillness of George's living room was punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a heavily sedated Todd. Eileen and George sat across from each other, the weight of their unspoken fears hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. The flimsy good news Todd had clung to felt more like a desperate shield, a flimsy attempt to ward off a truth too terrifying to articulate. "He's plastered," Eileen whispered, her voice barely audible, "but you're not that far off yourself." George nodded, a grim acknowledgement. The celebratory drinks had done little to dull the gnawing anxiety. "I can't cope with him when he's like this," Eileen continued, her gaze fixed on Todd's slumped form. "Just want to stay here with you, my mate." Her words, raw with affection and concern, underscored the deep bond they shared, a bond now tested by an invisible enemy. As the night wore on, the alcohol began to wear off, replaced by a cold, sober dread. George's mind raced, replaying every cryptic utterance from Todd, every fleeting expression of fear he tried to mask with forced bravado. He thought of the earlier conversation with Gary, where Todd had been uncharacteristically distracted, his usual sharp wit dulled by an unseen burden. "He just seems a bit off," Gary had confessed, echoing George's own observations. "Feels like something he's not telling me." The pieces were slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to fit together. The silence in the room became oppressive. Eileen eventually broke it, her voice laced with a newfound resolve. "We can't just let this go, George. Not when he's like this." George looked at her, seeing the same fierce determination in her eyes that mirrored his own. They were a makeshift family, united by their love for Todd, and they would not stand idly by while he fought a battle in secret. Morning arrived, gray and unforgiving. Todd stirred, groaning as the harsh light filtered through the curtains. His head throbbed, his mouth felt like sandpaper, and the events of the previous day crashed over him in a sickening wave. The good news felt less like a victory and more like a deferral, a temporary stay of execution. He had tried to outrun it, to drink it away, but the truth was relentless. He sat up, pushing down the nausea that threatened to overwhelm him, and found George watching him, his face a mixture of concern and unwavering resolve. There was no escaping the conversation that was clearly brewing. "Todd," George began, his voice soft but firm, "we need to talk. Properly." Todd flinched, his eyes darting away. "There's nothing to talk about, George. I told you, everything's fine. Just a bit of a scare, that's all." The lie felt hollow, even to his own ears. Eileen, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Todd, we saw your emails. We know about the hospital appointment. And we know you're not fine." Her voice was gentle, but her gaze was unyielding. Todd's bravado crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. You went through my emails?" He sounded more hurt than angry, betrayed by the very people trying to help him. "We were worried sick," George retorted, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "You were talking about your own funeral, Todd. And then you disappeared to the hospital, alone. What were we supposed to think?" A tense silence filled the room. Todd stared at the floor, his mind racing, trying to find an escape, a way to keep his secret contained. But the walls were closing in. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and raw, first at Eileen, then at George, seeing not judgment, but profound love and fear. It's not good, George," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper, the last vestiges of his defiance dissipating. The words hung heavy in the air, transforming the lingering anxiety into a cold, hard dread. "They found something." The admission was a punch to the gut for both Eileen and George. The good news was a lie, a desperate facade. George felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to stand by Todd, no matter what. Eileen reached out, her hand resting gently on Todd's arm, a silent promise of support. "What did they find, love?" Eileen asked, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes never leaving his. Todd took a deep, shuddering breath, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen horror. He began to recount the doctor's words, the symptoms he tried to ignore, the terrifying uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks. He spoke of the blood, the exhaustion, the shaky spells, the fear that had been a constant companion. And as he spoke, the full weight of his secret, now shared, seemed to press down on all three of them, ushering in a new chapter of fear, uncertainty, and a desperate fight for Todd's future. The morning light, once a symbol of new beginnings, now felt like the dawn of a relentless, harrowing journey. The raw confession hung in the air, a palpable tremor that vibrated through the small living room. Todd's voice, once so full of its characteristic wit and confidence, was now thin and reedy, laden with a vulnerability George and Eileen rarely witnessed. He recounted the clinical, dispassionate words of the doctor, words that had sliced through his carefully constructed world like a surgeon's scalpel. The blood. The exhaustion, Todd whispered, his gaze unfocused, as if reliving the moment. They said it could be something serious. They're doing more tests. But the way he looked at me, George. Eileen. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't telling me everything. A shiver ran down his spine, a phantom chill of the hospital room. Eileen's hand tightened on his arm, a silent anchor in the storm of his fear. George, usually so composed, felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd seen enough grief in his profession to recognize the prelude to true despair. This wasn't just a scare, this was the precipice of something life-altering. More tests? George's voice was strained, a desperate attempt to grasp at any sliver of hope. What kind of tests? Did they give you any indication? Todd shook his head, a single, solitary tear tracing a path down his cheek. They used a lot of big words, George. Words I didn't understand. But the feeling was clear. It's not piles, Eileen. It's not just stress. It's more. He choked on the last word, the full weight of his unconfirmed diagnosis crashing down on him. The cheerful facade he'd maintained for weeks, the forced jokes about grim reapers and funeral plans, now lay shattered around them. Eileen pulled him into a fierce hug, holding him close as if she could physically shield him from the encroaching darkness. "We're here, love," she murmured, her own voice thick with emotion. "We're here with you, whatever it is. You're not facing this alone." George, his mind racing, tried to process the fragments of information. "What did the doctor say about the good news then, Todd? The one you were celebrating last night?" He needed clarity, a foothold in this swirling chaos. Todd pulled back from Eileen, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, a flicker of his usual defiance returning, tinged with bitterness. The good news was that it's not immediately life-threatening. They ruled out the most aggressive, fastest-acting possibilities right off the bat. So, I don't have weeks, maybe months. I have a little more time. Time for more tests. His voice dripped with sarcasm, the hollow victory feeling like a cruel joke. The revelation hit George and Eileen like another blow. The good news wasn't an all-clear, it was merely a temporary postponement, a chilling confirmation that something truly serious was indeed at play. It meant a prolonged period of agonizing uncertainty, of more appointments, more waiting, more fear. "Todd, why didn't you say anything?" Eileen asked gently, her heart aching for the burden he'd carried in silence. He shrugged, a defeated gesture. "What was I supposed to say? Oh, by the way, I might be seriously ill, but I don't know what with yet, so don't worry, but actually, do worry a lot. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to scare anyone until I knew something concrete." He paused, his eyes meeting George's. "And honestly, George, your Grim Reaper jokes weren't exactly helping my mood." George winced, a wave of guilt washing over him. His well-intentioned attempts at dark humor now felt horribly misplaced, almost prophetic. "I'm so sorry, Todd. I had no idea." "No one did," Todd said softly. "That was the point." He looked around the room, a desolate expression on his face. I needed to prepare. For whatever comes next. I needed to plan. Because when it comes, George, I want a good send-off. I want to know I lived, really lived, before I couldn't anymore." His words, initially about a funeral, now resonated with a far deeper, more desperate meaning. It wasn't about a morbid fascination with death, but a raw, primal fear, driving him to seize control in the face of utter powerlessness. He was planning for his end, not out of acceptance, but out of a desperate struggle to impose order on an existence that had suddenly become terrifyingly unpredictable. Eileen hugged him again, tighter this time. "You're not going anywhere, Todd Grimshaw," she declared, her voice cracking but firm. "We'll get through this. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. And we'll fight it, every step of the way." George, wiping a stray tear from his own eye, nodded solemnly. His role as an undertaker, usually focused on the final farewells, now felt irrevocably shifted. He was no longer just Todd's friend or surrogate parent, he was a warrior in an undeclared war, ready to stand on the front lines with him. The morbid jokes about death were gone, replaced by a fierce, unyielding determination to cling to life. The battle for Todd's future had just begun, and the weight of their collective fear was now joined by the strength of their shared resolve. The road ahead would be long, fraught with agonizing waits and terrifying news, but for the first time, Todd Grimshaw was not walking it alone. The immediate relief of confession had, for Todd, quickly morphed into a fresh wave of paralyzing dread. Now that the secret was out, it felt more real, more terrifying. He had relinquished control of his private torment, and in doing so, had opened the floodgates to a fear that was no longer his alone to bear. He looked at Eileen and George, their faces etched with newfound sorrow and determination, and a pang of guilt shot through him. He hadn't just revealed his own potential mortality, he had burdened them with it too. What exactly did not immediately life-threatening mean? Eileen pressed, her voice sharp with a protective edge. Did they rule out the worst? Or just the fastest? Her eyes, usually so full of warmth, now held a glint of steel, ready to confront any adversary. Todd shook his head slowly, his earlier sarcasm replaced by a chilling candor. They didn't rule anything out, Eileen. They just said it wasn't acute. Meaning I'm not going to keel over next week. But it also means it could be something that progresses. Something insidious. He used the word like a curse, the thought of a silent, creeping illness more terrifying than a sudden, swift end. George, ever the practical one, despite his inner turmoil, began to formulate a plan. Right. We need details. The exact name of the tests, the clinic, the doctor. We'll get a second opinion if we have to. We'll find out everything. His voice was firm, a much-needed anchor in the swirling uncertainty. But Todd suddenly pushed back, a flicker of his old, stubborn self returning, mixed with a raw, desperate fear. No. You can't just go poking around. They said they'd call me with the next steps. I need to handle this my way. His eyes darted nervously between them, a hunted look about him. He had opened the door to his secret, but he hadn't invited them to take over. Your way, Todd? Eileen countered, her voice rising slightly. Your way was to sit alone, terrified, planning your own funeral. That's not a way, love, that's a slow descent into panic. And what do you want me to do, Eileen? Scream it from the rooftops? Print it in a gazette? Todd Grimshaw might be dying, but nobody knows what of yet. Do you have any idea what that would do to my business? To my reputation? He was lashing out, the fear morphing into a desperate need for control over the last vestiges of his normal life. George stepped between them, his hands raised in a calming gesture. Todd, nobody's suggesting you make a public announcement. But you can't face this alone. We're not trying to take over, we're trying to support you. There's a difference. Todd ran a hand through his hair again, his breathing ragged. I need to think. This isn't just about me, is it? What about Billy? Summer? What am I supposed to tell them? How do I tell Billy that I might have whatever this is? His voice cracked on Billy's name, the thought of inflicting this pain on his beloved hitting him harder than his own potential fate. Suddenly, a loud, insistent knocking echoed through the quiet flat, startling all three of them. It was sharp, demanding, a jarring intrusion into their intimate, terrifying discussion. Todd's eyes widened, a fresh wave of panic washing over him. Who could that be? He whispered, glancing nervously at the door. Eileen and George exchanged a look. It was too early for most visitors, and too urgent for a casual drop-in. George moved towards the door, a sense of foreboding settling over him. As he reached for the handle, another series of rapid, almost frantic knocks reverberated through the wood. George, wait, Todd hissed, leaping up, suddenly galvanized. Don't open it. But it was too late. George, caught off guard, had already pulled the door open. Standing on the doorstep, his face pale and contorted with alarm, was Billy Mayhew. His eyes, usually serene, were wide with a frantic energy. He clutched his phone in one hand, its screen still lit up with an urgent message. George. Eileen. Have you seen Todd? Billy stammered, his voice breathless, his gaze sweeping frantically past George and landing on Todd, who stood frozen in the living room. Todd, I just got a call from the hospital. There's been a mix-up with your results. They need you back there immediately. They said it's urgent. Something about false positives and a critical oversight in the initial readings. The words hung in the air, electric with a terrifying ambiguity. False positives, was it good news, meaning the initial scare was unfounded? Or was it a critical oversight that had somehow masked a worse truth? The glimmer of hope was instantly overshadowed by a chilling new layer of uncertainty and the abrupt, urgent demand for Todd's immediate return. The battle for Todd's life was about to take an unexpected and potentially devastating turn. The air in George's flat crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Billy's words, a whirlwind of medical jargon and breathless urgency, had plunged them from one abyss of fear into an entirely new, even more terrifying one. False positives and critical oversight, the phrases swirled in Todd's mind, a dizzying contradiction that offered a sliver of hope even as it threatened a deeper, darker revelation. Todd stared at Billy, his face a mask of shock and confusion. False positives? What are you talking about, Billy? I just had good news yesterday. What oversight? He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. Had his desperate relief been a cruel, temporary mirage? Billy, still catching his breath, stepped into the room, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and desperate hope. "I don't know all the details, Todd." The message was from Dr. Evans' office. It said there was an error in the initial processing of your samples. They specifically mentioned a misidentification of markers and that your presence was critically required for immediate re-evaluation. He held up his phone, as if the screen itself held the answers, though it only displayed a missed call and a curt voicemail summary. Eileen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A misidentification? Does that mean it could be nothing? Or something worse that they missed? The ambiguity was a torment, oscillating wildly between extreme relief and unimaginable terror. George, ever the calm voice in a crisis, though his heart hammered against his ribs, put a hand on Billy's shoulder. "Billy, slow down. What exactly did the voicemail say?" "Every word." He knew that in moments of panic, details could be lost, misinterpreted. Billy, still visibly shaken, tried to compose himself. It was very brief. Something about an urgent review of yesterday's results. They emphasized the critical nature of the immediate re-evaluation due to anomalies in the diagnostic profile. And they said, "They strongly advised you to come back to the hospital straight away, Todd. Not to delay." The implication hung heavy. This wasn't a minor administrative error. This was a potentially life-altering mistake. Had the good news Todd received yesterday been based on fundamentally flawed information? And if so, what was the real truth lurking beneath? Todd felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The brief moment of respite he'd felt, the desperate clinging to a partial truth, had been snatched away. He had bared his soul to George and Eileen, only for the ground beneath them all to shift once more. I need to go," Todd stammered, his mind racing. He grabbed his coat, a sudden, frantic energy propelling him forward. The thought of delaying, of prolonging this agonizing uncertainty, was unbearable. "We're coming with you," Eileen declared, her voice resolute. There was no argument, no question. This was no longer just Todd's private battle, it was a collective siege. Billy nodded fiercely. "Of course. I'll drive. I'm already halfway out the door anyway." As they rushed out of the flat, the gray morning light seemed to intensify, casting long, ominous shadows ahead of them. The journey to Weatherfield Hospital felt endless, each street, each traffic light, a cruel prolongation of their agony. The normal sounds of the street, the distant rumble of a bus, the chatter of early morning commuters seemed muted, insignificant against the storm brewing within them. When they finally arrived, the atmosphere at the hospital felt different from yesterday. The usual hum of activity was present, but to Todd, it felt charged, expectant. As soon as he approached the reception desk, a harried nurse, recognizing his name from a hastily scrawled note, immediately directed them to a private consultation room. There was no waiting, no bureaucracy, just an urgent, almost desperate, ushering. Dr. Evans, a severe-looking woman with kind but tired eyes, was already waiting. Her face was grave, her hands clasped tightly on the desk. She didn't offer a polite greeting, her focus was entirely on Todd. "Mr. Grimshaw," she began, her voice low and serious, "thank you for coming back so quickly. There has indeed been a significant error regarding your test results from yesterday. An administrative and technical oversight led to a critical misinterpretation of your initial blood panel and pathology reports." Todd's heart hammered. He gripped the edge of the chair, bracing himself. Eileen squeezed his hand, her knuckles white. George and Billy stood behind them, their faces grim. "The good news we conveyed yesterday," Dr. Evans continued, her gaze unwavering, "was based on an incomplete and ultimately flawed dataset. While the rapid-acting, immediately life-threatening conditions we initially ruled out do remain ruled out, the deeper, more comprehensive analysis of your samples today has revealed a very different picture." She paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath, her eyes locking with Todd's. The silence in the room was deafening, a vacuum before an inevitable explosion of truth. "Mr. Grimshaw," she said, her voice now softer, laced with profound regret, "I'm afraid what we've discovered is far more concerning than anything we discussed yesterday. The initial good news was, regrettably, a false sense of security. We now have a clearer, and unfortunately, a much graver, understanding of your condition." The words hit Todd like a physical blow, stripping away every last shred of hope he had desperately tried to cling to. The relief had been a lie. The reprieve, a cruel illusion. His world, which had briefly seemed to stabilize, was now spinning wildly, plunging him into an abyss far deeper and darker than he had ever imagined. The real fight, the truly terrifying one, had just begun. The air in the consultation room thickened, heavy with Dr. Evans's grave pronouncement. Todd felt a sickening lurch, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The careful composure he'd tried to maintain shattered, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. "Grave?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a desperate plea for clarification, for a shred of the truth to make sense. Eileen's grip on his hand tightened to a painful vice, her knuckles bone-white. George stepped forward, his face pale but firm, his eyes fixed on the doctor. "Dr. Evans, please. What exactly are we talking about here? We need specifics." His voice, usually so steady, had a tremor of urgency. Billy, who had been standing silently, a horrified witness, let out a small, strangled sound, his hand reaching out instinctively towards Todd. The fear he'd felt on the phone was nothing compared to the cold dread that now seeped into every corner of the room. Dr. Evans nodded, her gaze compassionate but resolute. She understood the weight of her words. "Mr. Grimshaw, the re-evaluation of your samples, particularly the advanced genetic and cellular markers, has revealed significant abnormalities. We've detected a cluster of highly aggressive cells. These are not merely indicators of stress or minor irritation, as initially suggested by the flawed reports." Todd felt a coldness spread through him, a chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Aggressive cells? The words echoed in his head, sinister and unforgiving. He knew, instinctively, what those words implied. Dr. Evans continued, choosing her words carefully but directly. "Specifically, the pathology report now indicates the presence of a rare and aggressive form of colorectal cancer." The world tilted. The words, delivered with a professional solemnity, hit Todd with the force of a physical blow. Cancer. The silent, insidious killer he had joked about, feared in the abstract, was now a terrifying, undeniable reality. His breath hitched, every muscle in his body freezing. Eileen let out a choked cry, her face crumpling. She pulled Todd into a desperate hug, burying her face in his shoulder, her body trembling with a mixture of shock and profound grief. George staggered back slightly, leaning against the wall for support. "Cancer. Todd." His mind struggled to reconcile the vibrant, often mischievous young man with the terrifying diagnosis. The Grim Reaper jokes, the funeral plans, they weren't morbid premonitions, but a desperate, subconscious grappling with a truth he hadn't yet consciously acknowledged. Billy's face was a mask of raw anguish. He sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands, unable to process the enormity of the news. The hope he'd carried, the frantic energy that had brought them here, had dissolved into agonizing despair. Todd remained still, utterly numb. His eyes stared blankly ahead, seeing nothing. The room, Dr. Evans, Eileen's sobbing, George's silent shock, it all faded into a distant, muffled hum. His own body, once a source of strength and vitality, now felt like a traitor, harboring a silent, deadly enemy. Dr. Evans, sensing the profound impact of her words, allowed a moment of silence before continuing, her voice softer now, tinged with genuine empathy. "I know this is an overwhelming shock, Mr. Grimshaw. We sincerely regret the initial misdiagnosis, which unfortunately delayed our ability to convey the true nature of your condition sooner." Todd finally stirred, a flicker of anger piercing through the numbness. "Delayed?" His voice was hoarse, a guttural sound of betrayal. "You mean you told me I was fine when I wasn't? You gave me false hope while this thing was growing inside me?" His gaze, now blazing with pain and fury, fixed on Dr. Evans. "Mr. Grimshaw, I assure you, it was an unprecedented error in lab processing," she began, attempting to explain, but Todd was beyond reason. "An error?" he roared, pushing Eileen gently away, the force of his anguish lending him a sudden, terrifying strength. "My life isn't an error. My future isn't a misinterpretation." He stood up, towering over the desk, his hands clenching into fists. "You sent me home thinking I was okay, telling my friends and family that I'd dodged a bullet, when all along, I had cancer?" His voice cracked on the last word, the raw agony undeniable. The fury, however, was quickly overwhelmed by a terrifying, hollow despair. He looked around at the faces of his loved ones, Eileen's tear-streaked face, George's shocked silence, Billy's heartbroken despair, and the weight of what he had to tell them, what he now knew, became unbearable. Dr. Evans, though understanding his anger, remained professional. "Mr. Grimshaw, we need to move quickly. Due to the aggressive nature and the stage we now believe it to be at, based on the advanced markers, we need to begin further, more detailed staging tests immediately. We need to determine the full extent of the disease, and crucially, to discuss treatment options without delay." Treatment. The word hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into a churning sea, but one that felt impossibly far away. Todd sank back into his chair, his previous outburst draining him of all energy. The shock was too profound, the implications too vast. His mind, usually sharp and quick-witted, felt utterly blank, incapable of processing a future that had just been irrevocably, terrifyingly rewritten. The brief reprieve had ended, and the true battle for his life, a brutal, relentless fight, had just begun. And this time, there would be no good news to cling to.